The cord was still on her wrist when they brought her to me. Not tight. Whoever had tied it hadn't been trying to hold her in place. They'd been marking her, the way you mark a horse you mean to come back for. A strip of rawhide, stiff with old sweat and grease, looped twice and knotted in a slipknot. The knot a man uses when he wants you to know he can cinch it tighter any time he pleases. I looked at it a long time before I looked at her face. Her name was Clara Bennett. She'd told the soldiers who found her that, and they'd written it in a report that sat on a colonel's desk for 6 weeks before anyone thought to send it up to me. She was 26 years old. She had been living with the Crow, with a man named Amos Stroud, who had taken her from a wagon train 2 years prior, and she had survived by being useful and quiet and very still inside herself in the way that people learn to be still when being still is the only wall they have. I was 43 years old. I had been a chief for 11 years by then, and before that I had been a war leader, and before that I had been a young man who believed that the world was comprehensible if you watched it carefully enough. I had watched it carefully enough for a long time, and I had arrived at a different conclusion. The world was not comprehensible, but people were, if you were patient, and if you looked at them without wanting anything from them first. I looked at Clara Bennett. She was looking at the ground near my left foot, not in submission or not only in submission. She was watching where she was, the way an animal watches when it isn't sure if it's safe to move. Her hair was braided, Crow style, but done badly, the way someone does it to a woman to make her look owned rather than the way a woman does it to herself. She was wearing a dress that wasn't hers. Everything about her had the quality of something borrowed without permission. I said in English. I had spoken English since I was 12, learned from a trader and sharpened on soldiers and sharpened again on men who tried to use it to lie to me. I said, "Sit down if you want to." She looked up at me then. I don't know what she expected. Whatever it was, I wasn't it. I could see that in her face, the quick recalibration, the way she filed away one assumption and reached for another. She sat down on the blanket I had set near the fire. Not because I told her to, because she had decided to. That distinction mattered to me. It would keep mattering. Her husband had been killed on the wagon train. This I learned over days, not hours. She didn't offer things about herself the way some people do, spilling out their story because they're afraid of silence. She had made a long peace with silence. What she told me in pieces, and I came to understand that each piece was a test, not of me, but of herself. She was finding out what she could say out loud without it destroying her. His name had been Thomas Bennett. He had been a farmer from Ohio who believed in the West the way some men believe in God, as a place where things would finally make sense, where he could become the version of himself he'd always suspected was in there somewhere. She had loved him. She said this plainly, without decoration, the way you state a fact that is also a wound. He'd been dead 2 years and 4 months. I didn't say I was sorry. I had learned early that saying you are sorry for a thing you did not cause is mostly for the person who says it, not the person who needs it. I let what she'd said sit between us and be what it was. After a while, she seemed to notice that I hadn't tried to smooth it over, and something in her settled a fraction. Stroud had taken her because she was young and capable and undefended. He kept her because she learned quickly and didn't fight him in ways that cost her more than they cost him. I had heard of Stroud. He moved between Crow and Blackfoot territory, trading horses, trading women, selling information to whoever was buying. He was not a bad man the way a coward is bad, or a weak man is bad. He was bad the way a tool is bad, designed for a purpose that shouldn't exist. The cord on her wrist had been his mark, mine come back for. On the 3rd day she was with us, I cut it. I did it simply, without ceremony, while she was eating. I took my knife and I reached across and I slipped the blade under the rawhide and I drew it up and the knot fell open. She went very still. I set the knife down and went back to my food and didn't make anything of it, because making something of it would have made it about me. She didn't say anything. That night I heard her cry, and I let her cry, because she had earned it, and because some grief requires witness and distance both, and I was the only one available. I should tell you about the camp, because you won't understand any of this if you think of it as a dramatic moment floating in empty air. Life is not dramatic moments. Life is the tissue around the moments, the ordinary days that make extraordinary things possible. We were in the Black Hills then, in the moon the whites call September. The camp was 40 lodges, maybe 160 people, and we had been moving since early summer following the buffalo, which had been moving wrong that year, too far north, too scattered. So there was tension in the camp about food and about the soldiers, who were pushing farther east than they had promised, and about the summer's council, which had gone badly, and about a dozen other things that don't simplify into a story about a woman with a cord on her wrist. My wife had died 3 winters before. Her name was Morning Star. She had been sick a long time before she died, and the dying had been slow, and she had faced it with the same directness she brought to everything, which was one of the things I had loved about her. After she died, I was a man with a shape missing. Not broken, that's not quite right. More like a lodge with one pole pulled out, still standing, still functional, but listing a little in the wind. I had 2 daughters, both grown and living with their husbands' bands. I had a son, Hawk Sitting, who was 17 and beginning to be a man in ways that made me proud and frightened in equal measure. I had responsibilities that didn't stop because I was lonely. So I was not lonely in any simple way. I was occupied every day with the 1,000 things a chief is occupied with. But at night, sitting with the fire, there was the shape missing. I say this not to explain what happened with Clara Bennett, but to give you the honest ground it happened on. She started to be useful around the camp within the first week. Not because anyone asked her to, because she couldn't stand not being. She was, I came to understand, a woman who needed to contribute in order to feel that she had a right to exist in a place, as if presence without usefulness was a kind of theft. She helped with the hides. She was good with her hands, precise and patient, and she learned the techniques fast and didn't pretend to know things she didn't know. The women in the camp watched her the way you watch a strange dog that seems well-behaved, not yet trusting, but willing to wait and see. 2 of the women taught her words. She learned fast and seriously, with the concentration of someone who understands that language is safety. Within 3 weeks, she could navigate basic conversation. Within 6 weeks, she was dreaming in it. She told me this one morning without thinking, and then looked startled that she'd said it, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a while, which was the specific pleasure of someone letting you see them without meaning to. I began to find reasons to sit near where she was working. This is not as romantic as it sounds. A chief moves through the camp constantly, checking things, adjudicating small disputes, thinking out loud at whoever is willing to listen, receiving information. It is not unusual to linger in one part of the camp for a while. What was perhaps unusual was the direction of the lingering. She noticed. I know she noticed because she began to work slightly more carefully when I was nearby, in the way people do when they know they're being watched by someone whose opinion they have assigned weight to. I found this unreasonably satisfying. One afternoon, I sat down near her and watched her work for a while, and then I said, "What did you want to be before?" She didn't ask before what, she knew. She thought about it for longer than most people would. Then she said, "I wanted to have a garden." Just a garden. A real one, not just vegetables, flowers too. Things that didn't have to be useful. I thought about Morning Star, who had kept a garden near the camp every summer we were together, who had known the name of every growing thing, who had brought me flowers sometimes for no reason other than that she thought I would like them. I said, "There are flowers here if you know where to look." She looked at me. I said I could show you. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "All right." It wasn't a courtship, or it wasn't only a courtship. It was 2 people who had each lost the central thing. She had lost Thomas and I had lost Morning Star, and in a different way, we had each lost the world we'd understood ourselves to be living in, sitting together in the hills and talking about things that weren't heavy, which was its own kind of relief. She asked me questions that no one asked me, not about leadership or strategy or the soldiers or the council. She asked what I thought was the most beautiful sound, and I said the particular silence just before a storm breaks, and she said for her it was the sound of a door closing on a warm room in winter. She asked what I missed about being young. I told her I missed the certainty, not the correctness of it, just the feeling. She nodded like I'd said something she'd been waiting to hear confirmed. I asked her about Thomas, not with the question forming in my mind that I wanted her to let go of him. I had no right to that, and besides, I had not let go of Morning Star and did not intend to. I asked because he had mattered to her, and things that matter to people matter to me. She talked about him for a long time one afternoon, sitting on a flat rock above the river, the sun going sideways into the valley. She talked about his laugh, which she said was too loud and completely unself-conscious, the kind of laugh you either loved or found embarrassing, and she had loved it. She talked about the way he'd planned the farm, detailed plans, drawn out on paper, where every field would be, which crops, which direction the house would face for the morning light. She said he'd been wrong about a lot of the practical things, but the wrong things had been right in spirit, and she thought that might be the best way to be wrong. When she finished talking, she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Do you think about her still?" I said, "Every day." She nodded, and then after a moment, "Good." I looked at her. "It would be worse if you didn't," she said. "It would mean she wasn't real to you, and if she wasn't real to you, I wouldn't trust that you were either." I sat with that for a while. Then I said, "That's a very clear way of thinking." She half smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her, not performed, not polite. Thomas always said I was too logical for a woman. He was wrong about that too. The half smile went all the way, and I felt the shape missing shift slightly, not fill, not go away, just change its position, like a wound healing into something that still marks you but doesn't stop you moving. Stroud came in late October. I had expected this. He had information networks better than most cavalry scouts, and he would have known where Clara was within a month of the soldiers finding her. What I had not fully mapped was whether he would come for her because he believed she was his, or whether he'd come to trade her freedom for something he wanted from me. He came with 2 other men, both white, both armed, and he came into the camp without the courtesy of announcement, which told me everything I needed to know about how he understood the situation. He found Clara working with the women, and he stood at the edge of the group and said her name in English the way you call a dog. She froze. I was across the camp. I watched her freeze and I watched her make herself unfreeze, a visible act of will, her spine straightening, her hands stopping what they were doing and setting the work down carefully, which was the detail that told me most about what it had cost her to be near him, not the fear, but the deliberateness with which she managed the fear. She looked at me before she looked at him. I was already moving. I will not tell you what I said to Stroud. Some of it I said in English, and some of it I said through my son, who translated, and the substance of it was that he had no claim in this camp, that the cord he had put on her wrist had been cut, that she was not his and had not been his, he had taken, not been given, and that he would leave now and not come back, and that if he tested this, I would not use the patience I had wasted explaining it to him. Stroud was not a small man, and he was not accustomed to being spoken to this way. I had 40 men within sight. The arithmetic is very simple. He looked at Clara. She looked back at him. I watched her face, and there was something in it I recognized, not rage, not triumph, not even relief. It was the face of someone watching a door close that they had been afraid would stay open forever. Quiet, final, like a breath let out slowly after a very long time of holding it. Stroud left. Clara stood where she was for a moment after they rode out. Then she turned and went back to her work. She picked up the hide from where she'd set it down and she went back to scraping it, and her hands were steady. I stood nearby and watched her hands and thought about what kind of person comes back to the work with steady hands after a thing like that. The kind worth knowing, I decided. The first snow came in November. There is a quality to the first snow of the year that is different from all the snow that follows it, a quietness, a muffling of everything that usually sounds like itself. The camp changed. People moved differently in it. Indoor sounds became important. The smell of the lodges at night, wood smoke and food and close human warmth became the smell of the whole world. Clara had been given a small space in the lodge of Red Willow Woman, a widow who had a generous nature and a practical interest in having someone capable nearby who owed her something. This arrangement had worked well. Clara helped with Red Willow's children. Red Willow helped Clara understand the 100 small protocols of winter camp. But she came to sit by my fire sometimes in the evenings, not every evening. She wasn't a woman who pressed. She came when she wanted to, and she stayed as long as she wanted to, and she left without explanation. And I respected this so much that I found myself looking up whenever the lodge flap moved, which was information I tried to sit with neutrally. One evening she came in with snow still in her hair and sat down across from me and said, "I've been thinking about something." I waited. "When you cut that cord," she said, "you didn't make a speech about it." "No. You just did it." "Yes." "Why?" I thought about this honestly. Then I said, "Because making a speech would have been for me, cutting it was for you." She looked at me across the fire. The snow in her hair was melting. Her face in the firelight had the quality that faces have sometimes, open, for a moment, all the way down. Like a window with the shutter pulled back. She said, "I've been thinking about the braiding." I had done this about 2 weeks after she arrived. Her hair had come loose from the crow braiding. It had been done badly and it was always coming undone, and she'd been struggling with it. And I had said, without thinking much about it, that I could do it. I had braided my daughter's hair for years. She had sat very still while I braided it, and I had been careful. And when I was done, she had touched it with her fingers in a particular way, checking it. And she had said thank you with a voice that meant more than thank you. I said, "What about it?" "It was different," she said, "from the other one." "Yes. I know it was just practical. You were just being helpful." I looked at her across the fire. I said, "I was being helpful, that's true." She waited. I said, "I was also not only being helpful." The fire moved between us. The snow outside made its sound against the lodge skin, which is less a sound than a texture, a softening of the world's edges. She said, "I know." We were quiet together for a while. Then she said, "I'm going to stay." I looked at her. "Not because I have to," she said. "Not because there's nowhere else. I could go back. The soldiers would take me, I know that." She was looking at me steadily. "I'm staying because this is where I want to be. I want you to know that there's a difference." I knew there was a difference. The difference was everything. I said, "I know." She nodded. She stayed a while longer by the fire, and then she left, and I sat for a long time with the fire going down, and the snow speaking against the walls and the shape missing still there, but changed, still a shape, still a missing, but with something alongside it now that hadn't been there before. There are things I should tell you about the months that followed, and there are things that belong to the two of us, and I won't tell them to anyone. What I will tell you is this. She learned the language until she could argue in it, which she did, and which I enjoyed. She won some of those arguments. I let her know when she won and when she lost, and she preferred this to being managed. She was a woman who needed to know where she stood with people, not because she was insecure, but because she had learned, the hard way, that not knowing where you stand is how you end up tied. She had a garden the next summer, not the garden she'd planned in Ohio. Different plants, different ground. But she knew every one of them by name, the Lakota names, not the English ones, and she brought me things sometimes for no reason other than that she thought I'd like them. The first time she did this, I stood with a handful of purple prairie clover and understood something I hadn't had language for until that moment. That being seen clearly, by a person who has chosen you clearly, with full knowledge of who you are and what you've lost and what you're working with, that this is the thing. That is the whole thing, not rescue, not salvation, just the clean, plain gift of being known and wanted anyway. My son said to me once that spring, he was watching Clara move through the camp, laughing at something Red Willow's youngest had said. He said, "She belongs here." I said, "She decided that, not us." He thought about this. He was 17, almost 18, and he was thinking about all the things you think about at 17 when you're beginning to understand that the world is real and doesn't wait for you to figure it out. He said, "Is that why you trust it?" I said, "That's exactly why." That fall the soldiers came again, farther into the hills than they were supposed to come, and there were meetings and negotiations that I will not go into here because they do not belong to this telling. What belongs to this telling is what happened one evening after the last of those meetings, when I came back to camp tired in a way that went past the body. The tired that comes from holding a position with dignity against people who are determined not to understand it, who mistake your patience for weakness and your restraint for fear. I came back and sat by the fire, and I was a long time just sitting. Clara came in and sat across from me and looked at me and didn't say anything for a while, which was one of the things she'd learned about me that meant the most, that sometimes what I needed was not words but company. Witness without demand. After a while she moved around the fire and sat beside me instead of across from me. Close. Not touching, just close, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her, the particular human warmth that belongs to one person and not another. She said, "They didn't hear you." No. They never hear what they don't want to hear. I know. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, plainly, without sentiment, in the tone of someone stating something she has verified and is willing to stake herself on, "I hear you." I looked at her. She wasn't performing the statement. She wasn't offering comfort. She was telling me a fact. I hear you. Present tense. An ongoing act, not a promise. Something she was doing, not something she was willing to do eventually if circumstances permitted. I put my hand over hers. She turned her hand and held mine. We sat like that while the fire went down and the camp settled into its night sounds, and I thought about all the meetings I had come back from in the 11 years of being chief, all the times I had come back to an empty fire and sat alone with what couldn't be said to anyone because there was no one to say it to. And I thought about how the tire is different, qualitatively, structurally different, when you come back to someone. Not because they fix it. She hadn't fixed anything. The soldiers were still wrong and the hills were still at risk, and the world was still the world. But you come back to someone and the tiredness knows it has a place to be. That's different. That's everything when you've been alone long enough. I want to tell you about the braid one more time, because it keeps coming back to me, the way certain images do when they mean more than they appear to. The crow braid, Stroud's mark, had been a functional thing, yes, but it had been done with a kind of contempt in it. The way you braid something you own, the way you handle a thing that belongs to you and not to itself. There is a feeling in that kind of touch. Clara had felt it for 2 years. When I braided her hair, I was not thinking about any of this consciously. I was thinking about the fact that the braid was coming loose, and I knew how to do it correctly, and she was struggling. But hands know things the mind hasn't articulated yet. I think my hands knew that I was doing it differently, not carefully in the way of caution, but carefully in the way of respect. The way you handle something that belongs to itself. The difference between those two kinds of careful is not a small difference. It is the whole difference. She had felt it. I know she had felt it because of the way she touched the braid afterward, not checking it, really. Recognizing it. Like recognizing the difference between being seen and being watched. The slipknot she'd been tied with had been a wedding cord, in the end. Or what Stroud had called a wedding cord, which means it had been the legal architecture of his claim. A man using the structure of ceremony to formalize a possession. The structure without the meaning. The knot without the choice. I cut it. I braided her a new one, eventually, not her hair, not a literal cord. I mean what we built together, which was made of different materials. Made of the evenings by the fire. Made of the arguments and the flowers and the winter snow and my son's careful question. Made of her staying freely, with full knowledge, with her eyes open, and what that said about what she believed I was worth. That braid was not a slipknot. Slipknots are made to be tightened, or to be pulled free. What we made together was made to hold without holding, the way a good braid holds. Through its own structure, each strand keeping the others, none of them locked. I am an old man now. The hills are different. Everything is different, in the ways that things become different when history runs through them like a river through limestone and takes the shape out of what was there before. I don't talk about most of that. This is not the story for it. This is the story about a woman with a cord on her wrist who sat on a blanket by my fire because she decided to, and what grew from that decision over years, and what it felt like to be a man that a woman like that decided on. She is sitting outside right now. I can hear her talking to someone, Red Willow's granddaughter, I think, who is 8 years old and follows Clara around like a shadow because Clara talks to her as if she's a person, which at 8 years old is not always something you get from adults. I can hear Clara's voice, and then the girl's higher voice, and then Clara's again, and I can't make out the words but the shape of it, the back and forth, the pause, the laugh, that shape I could pick out from any sound in the world. I have been a chief. I have led men. I have negotiated with soldiers and lost and won and held the line and watched the line move anyway. I have done things I'm proud of and things that cost more than I knew they would. I have been young and certain, and then middle-aged and knowing better, and now old and still learning. The thing I know most clearly, sitting here at this fire on this afternoon, with that voice coming through the lodge skin. A woman who has been through what she'd been through, who has earned the right to be guarded and locked and done with men entirely. When that woman sits down across your fire and stays, and when she tells you she's staying not because she has to, but because she has decided to, you understand something about yourself that no achievement could have told you. You understand that you are worth staying for. Not because you're strong, or because you have power, or because you protected her. Because she looked at you, the real you, tired and grieving and listing in the wind, and she said, "Yes, that one, I want that one." That's the cord she braided for me. Not rawhide, not a slipknot, not something you cinch and own. Something you earn. I hear her laugh outside now, full and sudden, at something the girl said. I sit with it for a moment, that sound, the most beautiful thing I know how to put a name to, and then I go back to what I was doing. She'll come in when she's ready. She always does.